This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
Julia Malott is a transgender woman in Ontario, Canada. After running as a candidate for her 2022 school board trustee election, she has been active in school boards across Ontario. Julia holds herself as a voice against illiberal ideologies and seeks to bridge conversations about sex and gender in a way that brings about workable solutions for everyone. And here's our conversation with Julia. Welcome back to Transparency, everyone. I'm Aaron Kimberly, here with my host, Aaron Terrell, and Julia, we're really happy to have you join us today. Welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
You came onto my radar because you're a fellow Canadian who's and there aren't many of us speaking publicly about this, but you came onto my radar in the context of a podcast that you've just launched recently, and it sounds like that came about because you were running for school board trustee in your province. And is it my understanding that your co-host or your Transparency was also a school board trustee in that election as well? Is that how you two met?
Yes. Yeah. So Christina and I are working on a few projects together, one of which is our own podcast. And she also ran as a trustee. She's in Waterloo. I am in Kitchener. So two cities that pretty much make one city combined. And so we were both running in different wards.
And so I'll link your podcast in our liner notes so that people can check that out. But I'd love to hear the bit of the background story about why you ran for school board trustee and sort of what was the context and what was going on in your world that you felt it was necessary to speak publicly like you have.
Absolutely. So for me, this starts really a few years ago. So my daughter is not my daughter by birth. She is actually my partner's little sister. No, one of my partner's little sisters. There's quite a few kids in that family. And a few years ago, she came to live with us. And this was right near the beginning of COVID. So school was online. So at first, she continued to do distance ed school from her birth parents live a few hours away. And then when she was going into her grade 10 year, she wanted to attend a bigger local school. So we enrolled her in the Waterloo Region District School Board here in our city. And for me, I was really uncomfortable and nervous because I remembered back to when I was in school 20 years ago and how trans people were thought of and considered back then, and thought, oh gosh, is anyone going to want to be friends with her? Or is she going to end up ashamed and embarrassed of me by having a parent who's transgender? So I was uncomfortable, and I talked about this with my partner, and then September came and my daughter was in school. And in the first few months of that, I realized that schools are very different now than they were 20 years ago. It was not at all a problem that I was transgender, which is great, but it was almost a status symbol. It was cool to have a parent who's transgender. And this was my first exposure to what's going on in the schools right now in terms of identity politics and in terms of just how much acceptance there is for LGBT individuals, which I think is a great thing, but also how much it has started to move into a realm of idolization, promotion, encouragement. There's lots of words you could use to describe it, but a place that I was shocked. I was a little bit uncomfortable seeing just how these matters are being handled, and thought this has got to be leading some kids into this domain in a way that maybe isn't helpful for them. And I knew of some of the books, like Abigail Shrier's book that had come out around this time. I had not read it yet. I was actually quite scared of it because everything I was reading online talked about how hateful and horrible it was. But that's when I started to think about these books and thought maybe I should look into this a bit and see what's going on. I'm just going to pause for one moment. Puppy, stop, okay? Okay. Winston needs to be lifted up. So I'm not letting you outside, but I will lift you up on the couch. This dog can't go up on the couch himself. This dog can. There. Okay.
Excellent.
That's cute.
I'll see if I can continue from where I was. And so then, and so that was how my daughter's grade 10 year started. And then in January of that year, a teacher named Carolyn Berjowski went to the Waterloo Region District School Board with a presentation about books in the school libraries and whether they were appropriate or not. And these books, many of them were LGBT focused, although they weren't all. And her presentation was just highlighting whether or not they had the same element that I was noticing of encouragement in terms of maybe leading our kids down a path that isn't right for them. And Carolyn she's a wonderfully sweet lady. I didn't know her at the time, but I've come to know her quite well. And moving into this, I don't think she knew anything about how divisive this issue is. She just was a teacher, and she wanted to express these concerns that she was seeing in terms of how the school was operating. So she went to the board and she did a presentation. And about 4 minutes into the presentation, she was stopped by the chair. He was worried that what was being said was transphobic and that it might have human rights implications. So ultimately, they stood down her presentation. And I found out about this 2 days later when they sent out an email to all of the parents apologizing for the horrible transphobia that occurred in their board meeting. And of course, I can't help it. I've got to get it. I've got to see what's going on at that point. So the minute that I see that, I go to the website. They pulled the video down, but thankfully Twitter had the video posted. So I went and watched the video of her presentation. And I remember getting to the end of it and thinking, but where does the transphobia come? I thought maybe there was more video than what was posted. And then I realized that was it. The 4 minutes where she just talked about these books, and maybe it wasn't age appropriate because it was one of the books was for grades 2 or 3, and it was really talking about sexual attraction. And if a boy isn't, attracted to girls, then maybe he's gay. And she's like, maybe it's because he's a kid. Maybe it's because he just isn't thinking about anybody that way yet, and that's okay. And I come from the municipal sector. So I knew that 2022 was an election year. And the moment that I saw Carolyn's presentation, I just remember thinking, this is going to be the election issue in our region. We're going to get a lot of people on both sides of this divisive issue coming in. And that's exactly what we had happen. Typically in Kitchener, we would have several candidates running. We had 17 candidates who ran.
Wow.
And you get people all over that spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So I deliberated on it for a while. I wasn't really at a point that I was prepared to speak out publicly quite yet. I was scared for myself. I was scared for my family. And it's kind of nice in some ways to remain silent and behind a wall where you can think what you want to think, but not be held accountable for what you end up expressing publicly. But I ultimately did decide to run as I started to read some of these books and started to understand really what was going on, and understanding that I probably had a very important part to play because I am transgender, of course, so I do understand that side of the world. But I also understood this teacher's point, and I thought that what she was raising was very reasonable, and that these are conversations we need to be able to have. And as I've come to know Carolyn and talked to her since, she's told me about how she didn't even need all of those books to be banned. She just wanted to have the conversation. She thought that we should be at a point that we could sit at a table and we could talk about whether these books were okay. We could talk about what our standard is. And it's pretty discouraging that we're at a point that you can't even question whether or not these resources might go too far.
I saw the presentation too before it was taken offline, and I agree with you. I mean, she was just talking about the age appropriateness of some of the very sexually explicit material, like in an elementary school context, and she didn't say anything that I felt was transphobic. It was very focused on just the content of these books and the age appropriateness of that information. And is this the correct way to introduce some of these concepts to children? And I agree that conversation should happen. And the fact that it was very heavy-handed, the way that was handled and the way she was shut down and accused of a human rights violation, and that censoring and hostility isn't doing us as trans people any favors in society, because it makes us look like like we're fascist, totalitarian, dictators who are trying to control thought and control speech, and it's frustrating people.
Exactly. And for me, there was an element of curiosity. I didn't know Carolyn at that point, and I thought, I wonder where her views sit. I wonder if she does know trans people. I wonder if she really is out to cause a lot of problems for transgender people, but she knows she can't say that, or if she has no ill intention at all. So part of getting involved was I was excited to meet her and get to know her. And now she's a close friend of mine when I'm struggling. She's one of the people I call first. We went out and had wine, I think, last week when I needed to chat for a few hours. And any of these narratives that I see online about transphobia couldn't be further from the truth. And it's discouraging that we frame anybody who questions anything about policy as inherently transphobic or hateful just because there's some element of how a policy structured that they think might not be ideal.
So what has been the reception to you speaking publicly about it?
So during my campaign, I stayed relatively quiet for a few reasons. One was just because I was busy, but if I'm to be honest, another part was it took a long time for me really to find my voice and be comfortable saying things. I wanted to play middle ground for quite a while, try to appeal to both sides, and so I didn't say a lot publicly. I also didn't want to spend a lot of money on my campaign, and I was able to do an election campaign without spending $1 at all, which made my campaign finance filing really, really simple. So that was a benefit. So I ran this minimal campaign where I had a website, I had 3 or 4 paragraphs I wrote, I answered emails and people sent me messages, I answered phone calls, but I didn't do much at all. And I actually performed pretty well in the election. I got 7 out of 17, and the top 4 make it in to be trustees for Kitchener. So I was really, really happy with how I did. The funny thing was I kind of knew that most of that was just riding on the fact that I was transgender. And a lot of people assumed they knew my message as a result of that. And as I started to get more vocal after the election and I joined Twitter at that point and started to really post stuff, I saw lots of really interesting conversations of people. Well, there was this one on Twitter. There's this one conversation on Reddit where someone flat out said, "I assumed I knew what she stood for because she's trans, but now that she's saying this stuff, I'm not so sure." And I think in many ways I benefited from being the token trans person, and people who align with that ideology and who want to see that policy move forward just presumed that I represented those views because I'm transgender. Speaking up was hard at first. It's scary. It's scary online in this domain because you get attacked from both sides. You get attacked from a crowd on the left and a crowd on the right. And I'd say the first few months were hardest because I didn't yet have connections. People like you, I didn't know yet. And so I felt a little bit alone, but it's been so nice to meet the community here in Ontario and in Canada who are aligned in concern on these matters. And what I've come to find in the last month and a half or so is that it's possible to speak because I have people who will back me up. I put out some videos last week that did quite well. And when I went and saw some of the rather rude or hateful comments that get posted, I didn't even have to deal with them because a lot of other people responded in my defense. And it's nice to have a community there who cares about what you're saying.
Yeah, I saw some of those videos and they were well done, right? They're just right on point and reasonable. And I think it catches people off guard sometimes, when they think that there are these, as you see, these sort of well-established trenches of thought on both sides. And when someone steps forward and says something not expected, it catches people off guard. If they expected you to have a certain ideological slant just because you're a trans person.
Exactly. I think it does catch people off guard, and it's humanizing to be able to remember that transgender people are people like everybody else. There's one parent who I've come to meet, not in my school board, but a different school board, because at this point there's about 7 school boards that I'm working pretty closely with in Ontario. And I met this parent in person once. We had a conversation for maybe 30 seconds, but they've seen the stuff I'm posting. They've seen some of the delegations I've done, and they sent me a really, really wonderful message privately telling me the impact that I had on them. And meeting me helped them understand that not all transgender people are the ideology that they were so against. And they said they went through their Twitter history and deleted a bunch of things that they posted because they're embarrassed by those now. And I barely know this person. I wish we had had more time to talk, but it's nice that I could make that kind of an impact just by existing and speaking up.
Well, it's nice. That's just kind of like one example of what's happening on a larger scale. It's like you got to have that one-on-one interaction and hear what happened in her brain and her understanding of all this because of what you said. But yeah, then all the people who you're not directly interacting with who are having the same kind of realizations.
Exactly. And I get so many positive comments when I'm putting out my videos, which is nice. But I also get another set of comments I've had quite a few people who either publicly or privately tell me these people are only supporting you because you're telling what they want to say, and they'll backstab you the moment that you don't align with their narrative. And that really comes to my other project, which is my podcast with Cristina Fernandez. So she was another candidate in the election, and I didn't actually meet her during the election time because I ran a very quiet campaign. And there were, I never know the word to use, so I'm going to say anti-woke. I don't love the word anti-woke, but I don't know what you refer to that side of the spectrum as otherwise. But there's a bunch of these candidates across our wards who had come together and formed a bit of an alliance as they were working towards their campaigns. And I didn't meet any of these individuals because I was running such a quiet campaign. They discovered me though about a week before the election. So I started to get these messages because they said, look, there's a trans woman who's saying the same thing that we are. What's going on with this? So Christina was one of the ones who reached out to me. And she actually invited me to their campaign celebration party. So all of these candidates had a big party at a local brewery, and she invited me out to it. So I went there with my daughter. It was a family-friendly event. And that was one of the scariest experiences of my life because I was walking into this brewery that was filled with all of the people who were financially and publicly supporting the 11 transphobic candidates as they were being called by our news. And I was kind of walking in unannounced and going to be meeting all these people. And I didn't know what to expect, but I had a strong pull that I needed to be there, that this was an excellent opportunity to meet and connect. And so I went into the brewery there, and that was actually the first time that I met Carolyn. I walked in, and within 30 seconds, she was right there, and she saw me and Maneuver gave me a huge hug. And then I spent the night there, and I met a whole bunch of wonderful people. And that was, for me, probably the moment, the wake-up call that I realized that people can disagree on matters, and that doesn't make them mean that they're not loving. That doesn't mean that you can't be in community, and that certainly doesn't mean that they want anything ill for you just because they might disagree on certain elements of my transition or who I am. And so that was the night that I met Christina, and we didn't get very much time to talk that night, but there was really good connection. She was really interested in knowing more and exploring more about my transition and who I am and what's going on for me. And she intrigued me as well because I know that she's very religious, but she was so interested, and I could feel the love emanating off of her from the moment that I met her. So we decided to start recording every conversation that we had going forward. So other than that 10-minute conversation we had at the brewery, everything was recorded on Zoom or eventually in person when she started coming to my house here. So we've amassed 40 plus hours of conversations, from the mundane, getting to know each other and finding out about each other's families, to talking about some really deep, tough stuff. We've had some pretty big arguments and challenging times, and we've still decided to record those too. So we have this history of our friendship forming. And for me personally, that has been wonderful, just to have all that on record. My views have changed quite a bit from talking to her over the last few months. And it's really humbling to be able to go back and watch how those views changed over time, and seeing stuff that I recorded with her 3 months ago and think, oh gosh, do I even want to release this? Because I'm embarrassed that I held that view 3 months ago, but I've kind of made a commitment that I will release these things because I think it's important to be able to be authentic about where I was at 3 months ago as I'm working through some of these matters and where I stand now.
I think that in itself is courageous, right? To just dive in. And I mean, what you're modeling in that case is authentic relationship, and how authentic relationship evolves and transforms, potentially both people in that relationship, and we grow. And I can definitely relate, and I'm sure, Aaron, you can as well, that over the course of our podcast, we've both evolved in our thinking about things as well. And looking back, things that I said in the past seem cringy now, but that's the whole point of doing this, right? It's meant, what's the point of transparency and the risk of transparency if we can't all evolve and grow together? And I hope that the people that have been our loyal followers and are along this journey with us are evolving along with us.
It's got to be extra kind of revealing, since it's just sort of meant to be like a one-on-one conversation, right, between two people, kind of like, as you said, basically just like getting to know each other all along the way and recording. And so are you releasing every single one of them, or was it just recording every single one of them?
Yeah, we have a release problem with our podcast. We're really good at talking to one another. We're not very good at editing. And we've realized we've kind of walked ourselves into a bit of a corner, because we have these conversations that make a lot of sense to us with the context of when we had them and how we had them. But when we start cutting it up, we go, oh gosh, this makes no sense when you don't have this 6-hour context. Because sometimes we sat for 6 hours and talked straight. And so by hour 4 or hour 5, you're referring to things that you talked about 2 hours earlier. And without that, it really doesn't have a lot of it's not very contiguous. So we are struggling. So we're struggling with what to put out, exactly how to go about it. We really believe there's a lot of important content there. The people who have heard some of the raw recordings have affirmed that yes, we need to put this out. We're still experimenting with the format a bit. Where we think we're going to land at this point is cut out little snippets that we think are important and then record us now talking about then. So start it by saying, we did this 3 months ago, this conversation, because this was happening. This is where we stand now, but then we can go back and play that clip and then at the end come back to it. That's where we think we're going to go, but it's evolving. It's something that we're experimenting with, and it's amazing how much time it takes to make a podcast. You two get episodes out a lot, and you must spend a lot of time putting this all together, because Christina and I certainly
I just show for the conversation.
Okay,
well, I do.
Regardless,
Until recently, I do the scheduling, but I know the editing is all thanks to Aaron. So I don't know that struggle.
I've become pretty efficient at doing it, so it doesn't take it long anymore now that I kind of understand the software. And we don't tend to edit a lot out of our conversations. We tend to leave them pretty raw.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think Christina and I have a focus problem right now too, in that we're both involved in so many initiatives across school boards, working with parents, making other videos that we each have our own families. So we're trying to balance all of that. But we need to get content out. Christina sends me messages every 2 or 3 days, passive aggressively reminding me that my commitment is to do what you're doing, Aaron, and to get things edited so we can get this out.
Could you give us an example of, for you, something that's an opinion that you held and changed your mind through the course of conversations with her, and maybe an example of one from her as well that she's shared?
Yeah, absolutely. I need to decide which one I want to go into. Yeah, okay. I'll talk about this one. Yeah, absolutely. So we had a conversation in our early days about the word groomer, because that's a word that gets thrown around online quite a bit right now. And I understand where people are coming from with the word. I also think that it can be used mostly just as an attack. It doesn't lead to good conversation. And so it wasn't a word that I felt particularly comfortable with. And it's a word that Christina was utilizing in some of her posts online. And of course, there's a large local crowd who's made it their mission to try to prove to me that I shouldn't be associating with someone like Christina. So every time Christina posts something that they don't like, I will get messages publicly or privately asking me if I affirm her and if I'm going to condemn her and all of this. And I have no interest in doing that online. I'm not here to babysit what she posted to tell her what she should or shouldn't say. But it did come up in one of our early recording sessions about what that word means, where the history is of where it comes from, and whether it really adds to the conversation productively or not when people are calling each other groomers. I don't think it's productive, but I was pretty upset and pretty offended in the conversation that we had when we recorded that a few months ago, because I was taking it personally in a way that I don't think I needed to. No one's calling me a groomer, but I made the association that some people are calling trans women groomers and that the word being used is directed at me. And so I kind of argued with her from that place. And going back and listening to that now, I don't think that was fair to her. But I think her view also evolved from that as well, because she did stop using the word the way that she was. I think she understood how it maybe isn't the most productive way to bring the conversation forward, regardless of what your intention is.
Yeah, that's a good example, and it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I mean, I don't want to be associated with groomers either. I don't feel that I'm guilty of that. But there do seem to be individuals within the LGBT that I would say are grooming young people. So it's difficult, right? How do we call out the specific individuals and specific actions on their part without implicating all of us in that. And I feel that's more challenging for some reason. I think because people in general don't really understand what trans is for the most part. Even those that want to be allies and supportive, I mean, if you ask them, well, what is trans? I don't know that they would necessarily be able to really define it in a deep way other than just the political narrative. Oh, well, someone whose gender identity doesn't fit their body, right? I mean, that's sort of the line that everyone's been fed. So I think people don't understand trans. It's sort of this vague, nebulous concept that a lot of different experiences and identities can get projected into. And everyone has their own pet theories of, including trans people, of what trans is. But I think it's really difficult for people to separate trans people or the trans experience from the current political narrative, the wokeness. Whereas I think other groups, like people of color, for example, I think people are better able to separate the color of someone's skin from these ideas that are floating around. And these are new concepts and new ideas. And I think that's easier for people to wrap their heads around, that I don't agree with these ideas, but I still respect people of a certain race or background or skin color. But I don't think people can separate transness in the same way from these ideas. And maybe that's in part our fault because we're letting those people speak on our behalf. But when people can't separate the two things, the growing hostility people feel towards the ideas it's landing on the shoulders of the people, whether we agree with those ideas or not.
I think what that has to do with.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah, we kind of exploded in numbers at the exact same time that the ideology, crept its way into the mainstream. So about the same time the general populace is realizing, oh, there's trans people in my kid's school, or now I've got this trans coworker, at the same time that they're hearing about how everything's transphobic, and it's like it all happened simultaneously, where it wasn't like, oh, I have had friends of different races, and it wasn't only until yesterday that all of this that what I'm supposed to understand about that experience has to be completely uprooted. So I think that could be a lot to do with it, is that they're unable to extricate us from the ideology because we became on their radar at the exact same moment the ideology did.
Yeah, and I think it isn't helped by the fact that we have taught and continue to teach people that you shouldn't talk about these things in public. When I transitioned at work, let me try this again. When I transitioned at work, I took about 18 months from when I started on hormones until I actually kind of came up publicly at work, because I wanted to be at a point that I was ready. But I'm a pretty open person. So about half my company already knew on various conversations, and I was being called both Jason and Julia in the office at the same time, which was very confusing for people who hadn't been told. But when we got to the point that I was doing a formal cutover, I sent an email out to the company and said, look, this is happening. This is what I'm doing. If you have any questions, seriously, come talk to me. I'm very open and happy to talk about it. And nobody did. Nobody asked anything. And that shocked me at first. But what I came to find in the months and years that followed is that people have tons of questions. Of course, they have questions about surgeries and how does this work with your family and all kinds of things. But they believe that it's inappropriate to ask, because that's what we've told them. And as I've seen what we're teaching in school, we're explicitly saying you can't ask this. You have to ask pronouns of everybody. You can't ask anything about why you're doing this, how you feel. You have to just pretend you don't see it, pretend that you're completely unaware. And not everybody's good at acting. So all of a sudden they're thinking, oh gosh, I don't know how to act on this person. I don't know what to say. I might mess up and say the pronouns they don't want. And then they're going to call HR and then they just don't want to talk to you at all. And I think that also adds to the animosity. And it's really unfortunate, because I think for myself and many of the trans people who I know, this is a huge part of your life. And who doesn't want to talk about their life and what's going on, as long as it is a respectful conversation from someone who's actually interested in knowing what's going on for you?
Yeah, I actually feel relief when people ask respectful, open, honest questions, and you can always sense the intent behind questions, right? I mean, in their tone or whatever. And as long as the question is sincere, I actually welcome those questions because that is the beginning of an authentic relationship with people. And it's kind of a relief for me to be able to let my guard down and just speak honestly about that experience and be understood by other people.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, no, exactly.
I'm curious. You said that it was 2020 when this all kind of came on your radar. So I'm curious, when did you transition? And it sounds like from that point on, you were very much offline if you weren't aware that about the climate until 2020. So yeah, if you want to tell a little bit about the rock you were living under until 2020.
The rock I was living under. All right, I'm going to back up a little bit and start many years before that.
Okay.
So my story is the same that you hear from a lot of people, which is that you always knew. And I struggle with that always knew because you don't know when you're 5. You don't have the words, but things never meshed well. I was an anxious kid. I was an unhappy kid. My mom would always say that I was the happiest kid she knew until I hit school. And from the moment that I hit school, I was anxious and I was unhappy and I didn't have any friends, and I saw so many counselors and therapists who were trying to find the solution of how we were going to teach Jason to get along with the boys, because this was the '90s, so that was the solution. And so they bought me a basketball net, and my dad would go out and play catch with me, and I didn't want to do any of these things, but that was what they were going for. And I was the theater kid. I was a very effeminate young boy, and that grew for me until grade 7. And it was in grade 7 that I really realized what wasn't lining up. I was talking to a friend in the schoolyard, and I was starting to really resent the girls and everything the girls could do and have that I couldn't do. And I made some comment like, but we all feel that way, right? Like we want to have, we all want to be a girl, and girls all want to be boys, right? Because we just haven't experienced that. And my friend just kind of looked at me and said, no, I don't feel that way. I don't think most people feel that way. And that was when it kind of clicked of like, oh, maybe I feel differently than other people do on this. So I spent that a few weeks kind of thinking about this and reflecting on it. And then I went to my computer and started to look things up. And it was funny. I had this old computer in my bedroom, and my mom did not like that I had a computer in my bedroom because church had taught her that your teenage boy was only going to use that for porn. And I have never looked at porn in my life. I have no interest. But what I did use my computer for was to look up was gender dysphoria. And back in the early 2000s, there was very few resources online about this. It was mostly blogs that trans women would have posted that were not informative from a scientific point of view, but they were informative in terms of the fact that this exists, that there are people who transition and them describing their experiences. And I remember the first time I came across a site, and I just thought, that's me. Everything they're describing about how they feel like that is me. That's what I am. And there was this huge sense of relief at that point, thinking, okay, I'm not alone. Like other people feel this way. I am alone because I don't know anybody and can't talk to anybody, but at least I had an explanation for what was going on. Or at least what I felt. And I shouldn't even say explanation because it was no answers, but it was just the being able to feel seen. Like I had some language now to make sense of what was going on in my head. So this would have been 12 years old, I think. And I should say here too that I was deeply religious. We were at an evangelical church, and this was right around the time that gay marriage was becoming a thing in Canada. It wasn't yet legal, but people were working towards that. So it was a big topic in our church. So I'm in a church here where I'm hearing about all of the horrible evils that it is to be gay and how we need to fight against this. And my takeaway from that was, well, if people who are gay are so bad, then like, what am I? Because they weren't even talking about trans people, of course. That wasn't on the radar. It was just people who are gay are so sinful and so horrible. And I internalized that into a lot of shame. And so I didn't tell anybody when I was in middle school and high school how I felt. I kind of held it to myself. And I was a very rational kid. So I started to read lots of studies online. I read some of the Blanchard studies and some of the Lawrence papers as they came out. I remember reading Bailey's book, was that 2005? Secretly, of course, I had to pirate it because I wasn't dare going to go to a library and be seen with any of this because I had so much shame that like, what if somebody saw? And I remember I had a spreadsheet going where I was kind of looking at the cost of what it would take to transition. But I think a bottom surgery was something like $17,000 or $18,000 is what I found online, and I had like $200, and I thought, how am I ever going to transition? And then I was
Breaking open
aware
the
of,
piggy bank. You're like, nope,
well, exactly.
doesn't add up.
Lemonade stand.
Yeah, it was not a prospect that was going to work, and my spreadsheet was thorough too. I'm like, and I'm going to have to run away from home and live alone, and no one's going to want to hire me because I'll be trans, and all of these. And it wasn't a proposition that made much business sense at all. So when I was in my grade 10 year, I, for whatever reason at that point in life, decided I have to make a decision. I have to make a decision now and go forward. I can't keep living in this, I don't know what I'm going to do place. And so I could transition or I could not. And I decided I wasn't going to transition because I couldn't even tell my parents how I felt. And I decided that, and I went forward. And I dove really deep into my church at that point, and ended up dating a girl that I later married. We started dating in that year, and we went forward and got married after that. And the shame that I had repressed continued to be there and continued to build. And it was there for, I guess, really until my transition in my late 20s. And it led to a lot of narcissism. And I didn't see it at that point. I caused a lot of pain for my ex-wife now, not from transitioning, but from my relationship prior to transitioning, because I was unhappy. I had chosen not to be happy by not facing this, and filled my life with anything and everything that distracted me from it. And that meant that I was also distracted from her. That meant that I was chasing financial success rather than relational success. And my life kind of came to a point in my late 20s where everything was falling apart. And it was all self-inflicted. These were bad decisions I was making because of my unhappiness. And when I eventually ended up in the hospital for suicide, I finally had the guts to talk to a psychiatrist about what was going on. And that was, for me, the start of going on the path that I ultimately went down with transition.
How long ago was that?
That would have been five years ago now.
Okay. Yes, 20.
I think that's how math works. Yeah, 2018 was the year. Yeah.
Okay. So you weren't enmeshed in the trans community, I take it.
Right. That was the question you asked, and I answered a very different question.
No, but that's all good information to have as well.
Yeah. So for me, once I made the decision that I wasn't going to transition in 2004 or 5 or whatever year that was, I kind of stopped reading things online. Every once in a while, maybe every year or two, I'd have a little moment that I'd dive in. I was always thinking about this, of course, but it didn't really matter what was going on. I had no community around it. I might read a study here and there, but I didn't engage deeply until 2018. And what changed for me then was that was right around the time it was starting to change in society. And I was very involved in theater, which meant that I knew a lot of students and young adults who were quite a bit younger than me. And their view of everything around transgender matters was very different than my generation. And so I started to hear things from them and see things from them that opened me up a bit to thinking maybe this isn't something that's as shameful as how I had always held it to be. I remember when I was writing someone a letter in early 2018, and I wanted to tell them how I felt about this. And when I got to the point that I even had to just write, I have always felt like I should have been born a girl, I couldn't write it. Just even typing it on my computer felt so gross and icky and embarrassing that I stopped writing the letter for weeks. And it was this younger generation that helped me to open up a little bit about this. And so that was when I started to explore what was going on, understand how society was changing. I still wasn't very connected in with many of the academic stuff that was going on and all the books that were coming out at that point. Those I got into later after my transition had begun.
Got it.
Yeah. So how do you make sense of your experience now? Like how, I think we all have to land on some kind of framework that makes sense to us just so that we can move on and get on with our lives. So what kind of, I know you said you don't really have answers, but what at this point does make sense to you? How do you hold together your own identity and make sense of your experience?
Yeah, I'd say that I've certainly gone through phases with that as well. When I was younger, when I was in my teens and early adulthood, I had coupled the justification for transition with whether or not there was a biological explanation for why people feel this way or not. Or to put that more simply, if I had a woman's brain and a man's body, then I should transition. If I didn't, then I shouldn't transition. So I spent a lot of time trying to find answers to that particular question. And no answers exist for that question, of course. So that didn't get me anywhere useful. When I eventually decided to transition, then when I was in my late 20s, I had been suicidal for a long time and continued to be suicidal. And as I mentioned, it was the shame that was keeping me from addressing this. And I had realized at that point that I might as well try, because if transition didn't work, I could still kill myself later and I wouldn't have lost anything. See, isn't that a rational way to think about suicide? So I started to transition. And of course, what that did was it helped me to work through my shame, and it ended up resolving a lot of what I had going on. But the question remains for me still, was it the transition that resolved a lot of what I had going on, or was it dealing with the shame of not dealing with how I was feeling that addressed that? And I don't have answers to that still today. I feel much, much better today. I have much healthier relationships today, but why that is, the verdict is still out in a certain sense. So as far as my framework, when I started to transition, I adopted a lot of the narratives that I think many people do when they transition. If they're looking for affirmation and support, and there is a community out there that will give that to you and will tell you what you want to hear, and will use the pronouns and will use the language that helps you to feel like you have a place and like you matter and like you really are. Well, in my case, I really am female. And so I had that given to me by a lot of people. And I think that was helpful for me in the early days, because that at least helped me to break down the shame and to work through a lot of what was going on for me. But I definitely reached a point of concern as I moved through this and came to understand that a lot of people in the transgender community really do believe that they're female in a way that they're biologically not, and that there are a whole bunch of reasons why that's problematic. So then I adjusted how I viewed it for myself and said, okay, well, I'm not female, I am biologically male. That has important implications for the health system, and I should acknowledge that for myself, but I am a woman, right? And that was kind of where I sat for a while. And that worked for me for a while. That probably worked for me until I started to have my conversations with Christina. Actually, one of our early recording sessions, I put her on the spot and I asked her, just, am I a woman or not? And I wanted to know what she'd say to that. And by this point, though, we already had a friendship. We had a friendship. There was a lot of love going on there. And so I knew that her answer was with love. And she told me that, well, no, I'm not. I'm a trans woman. And that difference was important to her, that the word trans sits there to qualify it. And I remember after we recorded that night, like I was just, I think 2 or 3 days, I was really distraught, and it was eating away at me that she had said that. And that was a good time for me to reflect and say, why did that bother me so much? It's a word, it's a word, it's a label. And I know she means nothing, no harm to me by it. So why am I so attached to being called a woman? And for me, that is a view that has been shifting and is continuing to shift. I don't really know what I am at this moment. I don't know what word's most appropriate. And I don't actually care as much as I used to either. I want to be around people who love me and respect me and want me in their community. And if they don't view me as a woman, that is fine. And if they do, that's fine too. And I don't know how to answer this question because I don't know how I view myself at this point. I've got a new identity crisis going on in a certain way.
It's a difficult question. Yeah. I think, by her offering, I see you as a trans woman. I mean, I think that's maybe, that does create space for you. I mean, she could have said, no, I see you as a man. So the fact that she said, I see you not as a woman, but as a trans woman, I feel like that's maybe a compromised place that I hope our society can settle on, that, from the trans community and the community at large, that it creates this metaphorical space for us in society, rather than, I don't know how else to articulate that, but I think that's a fair space for us all to enter into that isn't as divisive and polarizing and still allows us to present as we are and exist as we are and live with others without trying to manipulate what it means to be biologically male or female.
Yeah, no, I think you've nailed it there. And for a lot of people, I think the language becomes a concern because of the implications that rise out of it. They get very defensive. Well, no, I am a woman, because they're afraid of what it would mean to not be. What comes next? What are people going to exclude me from or prevent me from doing? And those are all important conversations that we need to have. But the language itself is just a word. And I think we spend a lot of time arguing definitions that isn't maybe particularly helpful for anybody.
I think I had a similar kind of trajectory you did, as far as like the kind of the yeah, the kind of like queer theory type language where it appeals. So you get kind of wrapped up in the kind of gender ideology stuff, because it tells you everything you always wanted to believe, and how, you know, it's really difficult to reject something because this is objectively false when it brings you so much comfort, you know, and reduces so much, yeah, shame, dysphoria, whatever it may be. And but then yeah, so I got to the same part where it's like, no, I'm obviously, I used to think that I was a transsexual male. That was a trans, you know, like transsexual was the adjective. What I was a male, right? It's just transsexual to get there. And then I realized, I can't remember exactly when or how, but I realized, no, I am you know, I can be a trans man, but I'm still and always will be biologically female. But I'm a man because that's a gender designation, and gender is different from sex. So, and then, you know, it's kind of come full circle where it's like you just kind of like these baby steps to wean yourself off of this really helpful yeah, just way of theorizing it. And it is just us manipulating language to make it us feel better, right? And so I you know, I can accept that I'm female, and the way I look at it, and Aaron, I'm not sure if you think that this might jive with what you're hoping for, is that metaphorical middle ground there. But I think of it as like a trans man is a type of female, and a trans woman is a type of male, rather than the reverse, which is what, you know, I previously liked to think of it as. So, but yeah, if the rest of the world, you know, would kind of, if we could, yeah, come together on that common ground and that kind of, what is it, you know, compromise. I don't see the trans activists liking that so much, though.
No, the trans activists, they don't realize that they're driving the extreme on the other end, and you know that the more radical the left gets, the more radical the right gets, because the right and the left are meant to balance one another. So it's yeah, I think the left is going to have to concede and roll back some of this. It's inevitable. Like, we can't just continue on doing what we're doing.
Completely unsustainable.
One thing that I learned over the last few years for myself too, I don't know how this applies to the trans man side of the conversation, but for me and for most trans women, you don't fully pass. So you don't get to a point that you can go out into the world and expect to perfectly blend in. And when I was subscribing to a lot of the queer theory way of viewing myself and viewing the world, I, with my friends, with people who affirm me, who love me, who care for me, and then they would mess up and say he when referring to me, because I would send certain male signals. And I understand that now, but at the time that would destroy me. I would remember that for days or weeks, not even want to see that person. But what I realized is that I was doing that myself, because I was creating a world that was untrue, which is, I'm female, I'm just like all the other girls. I go out there, nobody sees a difference. And the minute that then I get he, it would rip all that apart for me. And I think, oh, right, this person sees me differently. And they do see me differently, and that's okay. But to lie to myself and to pretend that they don't doesn't help the friendship, and certainly doesn't help my own mental health.
Yeah,
it's a very unstable place to kind of be reliant on everybody around you to maintain, you know, your internal understanding. It puts you in a delicate position and puts them in an uncomfortable position. Yeah.
And I resonate with something that you mentioned earlier, which is, what I really want to look for is people's intention behind it. If somebody is trying to use language in a way to get me, to hurt me, or to put me down, then that's a different story. But if somebody loves me and cares for me, why do I need to care language they use, what pronouns they use? It shouldn't need to matter so much. And I reached a point now that it doesn't. But it took a lot of work to undo some of those ways of thinking that I had adopted, because as you said, it makes you feel good. It's exactly what you want to hear, what I wanted to hear as I was embarking on my transition.
And it is something that we're seeing more and more on the gender critical side, or the radical feminist side, is that intention of hostility, right? The intention of not just retaining their understanding of material reality, but actually going in people's faces and saying, "You're a man," and there's no good that can come of that. I mean, yes, it's true what they're saying in terms of our biological reality, but it's crossed the line into just a form of harassment when the intent is to hurt and harm.
Absolutely. I think the intention is so important, and it's pretty easy to tell. My experience on that front, though, really has been quite tame. When I entered the space, I was certainly worried about what kind of negativity, to put it mildly, I might get in that respect. And it has come from a lot of anonymous accounts who can hide behind any sort of attachment to their everyday life. But as far as a lot of the more prominent names out there, I think there's a lot of mutual respect, understanding that they have concerns that I think have validity to them, that they're also being ignored. And I think the transgender people have concerns and have validity. And I do believe that there's a workable way forward that covers the needs of both sides of this discussion. And my experience has been that people see that in me in terms of what I'm saying and where I'm going. And so that's been really encouraging.
In the early days of trans activism, and I don't see it so much from the trans woman perspective, just because that hasn't been my peer group and my personal experience, but looking at it from the early days of trans men organizing and developing, a civil rights movement. It was a lot. It looked a lot more like the civil rights movement of the gay and lesbian community, or what we saw around, African Americans. It was a civil rights movement based on building bridges, helping people to understand our experience, and based on personal character and our responsibility in the world. I mean, the old school transsexuals wanted to integrate into the world and get along with people, and we don't do that by lying to people or screaming at them if they get our pronouns wrong. And so a lot of work was done. And I think, in the early 90s and the really early 2000s, a lot of progress had been made for social acceptance of trans people. And I feel like that's all being dismantled because of wokeism, that people are so frustrated with wokeism and this environment of cancellation and separation and hostility. It's no longer a movement about personal character. And that's ultimately, I think that's what we all want, is to be able to just live in our communities and be respected as individuals, regardless of our differences.
I hope that's what we all want. It's certainly what I want.
Yeah. I don't know how we lost sight of that, and I hope that that's something that we can come back to. It doesn't, because I think trans activists see it as an either or. It's like you either believe in wokeism or you believe in our annihilation. and they don't seem to see that there are other models of social justice. There's I mean, you two grew up in evangelical homes, so there's biblical social justice and how they define that. There's the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King Jr. Like, there's different models of social justice. So it's not about you take away wokeism and we have no model for social justice at all. So it's just this chaos of people, murdering each other. Like, so I hope that that's maybe a pathway forward. And I think that's what FAIR is trying to do. And I'm glad that they've moved into Canada. But FAIR is going back to the roots of a true civil rights movement and advancing, they call it a humanistic perspective, that they're advancing the dignity and equality of human beings without wokeism. And I think that is the pathway forward for us and I think it might be helpful for the trans activists to see this new model being built. I think it gives them I'm a big believer in build it and people will come, that if they see a space of dignity that they can move into, that might go better than if they feel cornered. I'm really concerned with some of the language that they're using online because they feel cornered, they feel desperate, they feel scared, and they're starting to talk about things like this is genocide and we need to arm ourselves. And I do worry, that how when they start to speak like that in the mob mentality and they're spreading these ideas of panic and violence, I do worry if they're cornered that they could become very unstable and real violence could happen. And so I think the solution is if you create a space of dignity and another model, and if they see us successful in building that hopefully they'll just come alongside us rather than feeling cornered and desperate.
Yeah, and that's the message that I've really been trying to send, is that you can question some of this ideology and still love transgender people. And a lot of the individuals who I am hoping will hear my message are the ones who have skepticism towards what's going on and are currently putting that on trans people themselves. And I want to be an example for them of how those two can be distinct, and you can be a loving, caring person and also question at the same time.
I think one of the problems is with finding the middle road, the rational way to approach all this, is a lot of the people I think who are drawn to basically be like, trans activism. I think a lot of it is the grievance that appeals to them more than actually transitioning, or more than the identity itself, or whatever it might be. I think the having a grievance, having something to fight against, feeling like you're somehow being you're righteously fighting oppression, like that itself is the draw. And I think they don't want that taken away. Like, they don't want a reasonable resolution, mutually beneficial. It's like they need a holy war to fight against, and that's what it all is about them. And I think those are the people who are really fucking us over, honestly. Yeah.
There's a great book by Mark Yarhouse about gender dysphoria, and he's a Christian author. And I got this book because when I started my transition, my mother said right off the bat she would only read Christian resources about anything I was doing. And I said, great, well then I will get all those books and read those books too. And in the end, she still wouldn't talk about it with me. But I had a great time reading a bunch of these books. And so Mark Yarhouse describes a few different frameworks within which you could understand transgender matters. And the first one of those that he talked about was what he calls the disability framework. And this is that concept that there's something about me and you that's, in a sense, a disability. Something is wrong. Maybe it is psychosocial, maybe it's biological. We don't need to know, but something is wrong. And transition, in some cases, might be an appropriate path in order to relieve that dysphoria and to allow people to thrive. And it's something we can do out of compassion. And that's the one he gets behind. And he's a supporter of trans rights and transition for that purpose and within that domain. And then he talks about another framework, though, that he sees emerging. I think this book is 2017, so it's a few years old now. And that's what he calls the diversity framework. And that is that mindset that it is about finding an identity and finding a way to describe yourself. And that's where you don't have to have dysphoria at all, because it's more just about the uniqueness of it. And that's the one that he condemns more strongly from his religious background. And for me, that's been a really helpful way to look at it too, is I subscribe to that disability mindset of something about me wasn't working, and now we found a way that I can live and I can be happy and I can thrive, and that's a great thing. But as we know, transition comes with medical risk, transition comes with expense. It's not something that I would want anybody to take if there's an easy path to help them thrive without it. And I think a lot of activists do find that very threatening, because they want this to be something that is just about diversity for diversity's sake.
It kind of circles right back to where you started with the concern about the glorification that you're seeing in the schools and whatnot, and that's exactly what it is. It's a celebration, and that's just drawing in people who are just being hurt rather than helped by it.
Yeah, and that has been my message to a lot of the school boards that I'm speaking at, is it's great that you are trying to create acceptance, just like we do lots in our schools to make sure that Christians and Muslims and people of all faiths are accepted. And we teach our children that people may believe differently than you, they may have different customs, and we should accept and include regardless. But when I see a wall that's covered in the 84,000 different sexual or gender identities that you can have with their unique flags and all of this celebratory behavior around it, my question to the schools is, and where do you discuss the implications of adopting some of these identities? Where do you talk about the risks of hormones and the risks of surgery? And where do you talk to the kids about what's going to happen if you do adopt one of these identities, but you come from a very religious family where that might actually be an existential problem for you and your household when you're 12? And if we're going to talk about it in the way that we do, I think you need to cover it from both of those sides, because that's part of the equation. Having been through surgeries, they come with a lot of baggage that people should know about. And of course, what everyone tells me then, not everyone, but what the activists tell me then is, well, that's not the school's job. And I agree, it's not the school's job, but if the school is going to be putting this stuff in such a way that it encourages people to think about these things, then I think it becomes the school's job.
Right. It's the school's job to glorify it, but to not warn about the ramifications. Yeah. Well, thanks for being here, Julia. This has been great.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
It's been wonderful to sit down and talk to you. And I'll put a couple of things in the liner notes. So I'll put a link to the Mark Yarhouse book that you mentioned, and your podcast as well, so that people can check it out.
Awesome. I appreciate that.
Okay. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.